I'm Dom Nichols, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, in a special bonus episode, I bring you a panel I moderated at the Ukraine Freedom Summit in London, featuring a distinguished lineup of speakers, including Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, who was US National Security Advisor to President Trump 2017 to 18, Boris Johnson, you may remember he was the former British Prime Minister, and Sergey Vysotsky, Deputy Chairman of Association of Strategic Communications at the National Association of Ukrainian Defence Industries, and Michael Kofman, Senior Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Titled The Strategic Architecture of Victory, the discussion offers candid reflections on Western failures, why Europe struggled to unite in the face of a growing Russian threat, Putin's motivations, America's true strategic position, insider insights into Ukrainian weapons procurement, and the West's capacity to wage a long war. Please note, this panel was recorded several weeks ago, prior to the developments of recent days.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Boris Johnson, we're speaking on a day,
yes.
On Saturday, it's awful to say it's the latest record Russian strike, but on Saturday night, Sunday morning, 810 Shahed drones were fired at Ukraine. It's the largest attack by drone since the start of the full-scale invasion. And last week I was in Prague at the International Institute for Strategic Studies Defence Summit, and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, when asked about Russia producing more ammunition than the whole of NATO, he said, well, we're turning the tide. And I thought, we are nearly 4 years into this, and you're coming out with phrases like turning the tide. So why after 2022, why after the invasion of 2014, why after Georgia in 2008, did successive European leaders, why did you fail to get Europe to stand up together and act in the face of a very obvious growing Russian threat?
Look, so first of all, thanks. On the bombardments that are happening right now in Ukraine, and you're right to draw attention to the increase in the numbers of drones and missiles, and it's alarming, but they are not yet doing damage on a scale commensurate with their numbers. I think it's very important, I'm sure people here know far better than I do, that, as I said right at the beginning, people in Kiev feel very far from beaten. And this is not remotely like the Blitz was in London in 1940, not remotely. And so that's point number one. Yeah, and yes, of course Putin will, like Stalin with the Red Star tractor factories, he'll start producing more and more of these drones. And sure, it will be, people will start to worry about the long-term implications. But I can't think of any population in history that's actually been subdued by aerial bombardment, except with the use of nuclear weapons. It just doesn't happen. And the answer is to give the Ukrainians the ability to fire back. And look at what they're doing to Putin's oil and gas industry. They're really starting to make a difference, and that's starting to bite. Give them the funding that they need for the weapons that I described, and give them this $250 billion. I think that's a huge sum of money. A lot of this is going to turn on money. Putin's starting to run out. He's in much bigger trouble than I think he's being told. And all this is just being held up by the Belgians at the moment. Belgium's got to get a grip and allow Euroclear to hand over that $250 billion to Ukraine. That would make a huge difference to their ability to defend themselves and to fire back.
A very elegant and comprehensive answer to a completely different question, if I may.
Was it? I could have sworn you asked about the bombardment of Kiev by...
Why is Europe so slow at getting together to take the threat seriously?
Well, I think, actually, if you look at what's happened, I mean, there are two sets. There's a 2014 onwards, and then 2022 onwards. I would draw quite a sharp distinction between the two sets of responses. In 2014, basically the West decided, I mean, HR, you remember this much better than I do, but I mean, we decided what to, do not very much, as far as I can remember. We sanctioned Russia, but we effectively...
Performative more.
It was performative. Yeah. We turned back. 2022, it'd be fair to say, there was a massive galvanic attempt to get the Ukrainians as fast as we could the support that they needed. And it was thanks to, I think, HR, that they already had by then the javelins.
Javelins, right.
And with the UK, by then we'd piled in, and by the time of the February 22 invasion, we'd given them the NLAWs as well. So the idea of giving lethal weaponry to Ukraine in 2014 was pretty remote. And so things had radically changed by 22.
How would you define victory for Ukraine in political and military terms?
Look, I mean, I think Ukrainians have got to be able to define that for themselves. I can't be more, I passionately support Ukraine. I want Ukraine to win. I believe Ukraine should have the whole of its 1991 borders. That's what I think. That's victory. And what I don't think is going to be acceptable is any attempt to try and do a deal which hands over sovereignty, I mean legal sovereignty, of some portion of Ukraine in the utterly deluded belief that this will buy off Putin, because it won't. It's just pointless. That sort of compromise is utterly pointless. So I just take you back, Dom, to what I was saying earlier on. I think insofar as there might be scope, and it's going to be very, very hard, and it will require much, much more pressure from the West, but insofar as there might be a possibility of getting Putin to compromise, it might be around something of the kind I described. Freezing along the line of contact, regretful but de facto acceptance that he's got what he's got, with Ukraine, of course, eternally wanting to, vindicating its right to that territory, but ending the killing. And, as I said, maybe in that context, Putin could sell it to his credulous public. But I certainly think that from the point of view of Ukraine, and again, that would be better than some of the outcomes that I've seen. And I think what is going to be difficult, and people will correct me, but my impression is to be very difficult to ask the Ukrainian armed forces to take back now by force everything that they've ceded since 2014. I think that is difficult.
Now, the Lord said, Mark said, your first national security advisor, he said part of the problem is that there are so many different and separate European defence industrial considerations. He said, for example, Europe fields 17 main battle tanks where the US has 1, and Europe has 29 destroyers and frigates, the US has 4. So that incoherence is not helpful. So we need to move away from this division and inefficiency and waste. I'm not suggesting we go as far as a sort of common agricultural policy for defence with, France, you make the tanks, Britain, you do this, or what have you, because that would just be chaotic. Yeah. But where do we need to be in terms of European defence sovereignty? What would be a good enough body, a transnational European body through which defence and security considerations could be discussed and sorted out?
Well, I think it'd be fantastic if we had a common agricultural policy for defence, if that meant that we had a surplus of munitions and that we had, taxpayers' money going into supporting European defence industries, so we didn't have this famine. I mean, we're still not making enough shells to help the Ukrainians. We're still not making enough drones. The CAPs, is the reverse problem. The CAP produces, as everybody knows, a surplus of this stuff. Not in munitions, but grain and butter and all the rest of it. Look, I used to be very sceptical about European defence collaboration, and still am in some ways.
Not just defence,
except I'll give you a very good counterexample. Airbus. Really, I think in all honesty, we free marketeers have got to look at Airbus and accept that it is a shining example of European technological leadership and collaboration. And I don't know what the market, HR, we're on the other side of the army, you're Boeing and stuff. But, they've had some difficulties, Boeing. And Airbus is making some fantastic machines. And the wings are made in Wales. Every single Airbus wing virtually is made in Wales. I think I'm right in saying. They make other bits elsewhere. I think they've got Rolls-Royce engines. It's a fantastic example of European collaboration. And I don't see why we shouldn't do that more in the defense field.
HR, you said recently in an interview with Czech President Petr Pavel on your Battlegrounds podcast, or he made the point, that the Russian mentality doesn't allow for a win-win situation. They believe they have to control and dominate everything, and they are either political winners or geopolitical losers. Do you think enough Western leaders see that similar strategic context for current and future global, but in particular for this panel, European security landscape? And do you think Donald Trump does?
Well, Dom, I don't think enough people realize that Putin is driven, by, he's a man obsessed. He's a man obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness. And I think it's really important in this case to consider primary sources, what he's said, as well as what he's done over the last 20 years. And he's made it very clear that he's driven by this sense of honor lost associated with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And what he wants to do is to subsume Ukraine and then create servile relationships across the former Warsaw Pact as well as the former elements of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire. And he won't stop until he is stopped because he's driven by that obsession. So I think not enough people understand that. And Dom, I think President Trump understands this at times, but also he's sort of torn. He has this dissonance about him between, peace through strength, which is a Reagan-esque phrase that he often uses, and this desire for a big deal and his confidence in his deal-making ability. I think in terms of whether a deal that is acceptable, to us, to Ukrainians, is feasible, I think Vladimir Putin is going to disabuse him of that endeavor. I think pretty soon, I hope. He's been on this path for a while. But like many other European leaders, thought that Putin could be conciliated. He just needed his security concerns allayed. And of course, that's not ever been what's driving Vladimir Putin. And if you look at the examples that we've already been talking about, after 2014, this idea was that you could have a reset. Remember the Obama administration reset with Vladimir Putin. And then, of course, that didn't work. President Trump wanted to get a big deal with Vladimir Putin during his first term. That didn't happen. But what President Trump did, and I hope he'll kind of remember, is he imposed more sanctions on more Russian individuals and entities in the first year of his administration than the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. He wound up closing 2 consulates, and he also expelled, this is also associated with the Skripal poisoning, which we worked on together, scores of Russian undeclared intelligence agents. And he was persuaded in that time that what provoked Putin was the perception of weakness. President Biden fell into the same trap, sadly, when he went to Geneva, laid out his red lines for Vladimir Putin, which was for Putin, that's a green light for everything else. And then pulled our ships out of the Black Sea, suspended lethal assistance to Ukraine, evacuated our advisors. All of this was meant to allay his security concerns. And of course, that's provocative to Putin. And that's what I think we have to all remember. Just quickly, it was President Trump. Wasn't me. It was President Trump who decided to sell and provide Javelin weapons to Ukraine, defensive capabilities, in December of 2017. And the way he made that decision was in the back room of the Oval Office, and I brought with me a chart that I rolled out in front of him. And it was a timeline that went left to right. And below that timeline was an event, a decision that portrayed weakness to Putin. The unenforced red line in Syria, 2013. And then above that timeline, I had a photo and the caption of subsequent Russian aggression. And the point that I was making was that Putin is not aggrieved. Putin does not need his security concerns allayed. What provokes him is this perception of weakness. And I think we've fallen into this trap continuously. I mean, how long did Chancellor Merkel think that she could be the one to convince Putin that his future lied with Europe and the West? So we have to disabuse ourselves of this idea that he can somehow be conciliated or satisfied with some territorial concessions or whatever. He will not stop until he is stopped. And I think to the point of this panel, quickly, I'm sorry to go on so long, is that he must be convinced that he cannot win the war. That's it. And that he's losing. And then I would just refer you to Prime Minister Johnson's comments here on what needs to happen to place more pressure on Putin at a time, and I share your assessment, that he's very weak and vulnerable from an economic and financial perspective.
Now, in terms of perceived weaknesses, can you talk to us briefly about the ongoing US force posture review that may see US capabilities taken out of Europe for the Indo-Pacific theatre, and what effect that would have on the war with these competing strategic priorities?
Well, it would have a negative effect, because I think what we demonstrated time and time again is that what deters Putin is hard power. Remember how everybody wanted to be nifty with this idea in the U.S. of integrated deterrence, which I think we should have just substituted pixie dust, for that. And this idea that you could threaten sanctions and that would deter Vladimir Putin, for example, or you could release intelligence and show what he was doing, and that could deter him. So I think that what really is essential, foundational to deterrence, is hard power, and that really is, for the United States, forward position capable joint forces that can operate as part of our alliance, our NATO alliance, to demonstrate to your potential enemy that enemy cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. That's what's essential. And those forces, again, have to be capable of operating at sufficient scale and ample duration to do that. And I think that's what we've learned quite dramatically since 2022, is that we have been so efficient for so long in the way that we structure our defense. We've been trading off capacity, size of our forces, capacity in our industrial base for fewer and more exquisite and expensive capabilities. So now we need those exquisite capabilities, but we need them in sufficient capacity, and we need to combine them with the sorts of weapon systems and capabilities that Michael and others have been observing so closely in Ukraine.
Well, you should blame Toyota, because everyone got fixated with the just enough, just in time model, didn't we, back 20 years ago. Now, whilst you're here, and forgive me, a little bit off range, but Pete Hegseth says that renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War will achieve greater focus. So when you were a very senior commander in Iraq, Afghanistan, when you were the National Security Advisor, still as a serving officer, working under the Pentagon, which is the Department of Defense, did you feel you could have done with a bit of a G up, a bit more focus?
This is a reaction. You could say it's an overreaction to what I would describe as the Biden and before that Obama administration's pushing of what I would call, a social agenda, a political agenda that's inimical, I think, to combat effectiveness. And, some people they throw out this label woke, but what I'm really talking about is this idea of equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity, what I would describe as the valorization of victimhood, and this idea that you should judge the person next to you based on their identity category, instead of what we know as soldiers, is you evaluate the soldier next to you based on their courage, their sense of honor, they're willing to sacrifice for the mission and one another. I mean, that's how we evaluate. So we don't give a damn what your identity category is. So I think what had happened is there was an observation that these destructive sort of reified philosophies based in postmodernism and various critical theories was distracting to the military at the very least, destructive, maybe at the worst. But now the cure might be as bad as the disease. So I hope we just settle into, as you're alluding to, focus on the mission. And the buzzword is lethality now. For me, that's kind of implied in our business. But if lethality is kind of the word, the lethality is the word. But of course, in the Department of Defense, you have to do a broad range of activities. Many of which are lethal, but some of which are not lethal and have to do with the integration of other elements of national power, efforts of like-minded partners to hopefully prevent war. So anyway, I don't know. Instead of a national defense strategy, do we have a national war strategy now? I mean, it's very confusing, very confusing.
I think in Orwell, isn't it called the Ministry of Peace?
That would be overly optimistic, I think, maybe. But right, maybe.
I think just call it Ministry of Peace.
Now, Sergey, we're talking about future security architectures. You can't have an architecture without a base. That's where the defense industrial base comes in. See what I did there? National Association for Ukrainian Defense Industries. I've not met you before. I need to learn more about your work. Formed in 2020, I now learn, uniting leading manufacturers in the country. President Zelensky said in his nightly address Saturday just gone that nearly 60% of the weapons used on the front line are produced in Ukraine. Now, I noticed he said the front line, so possibly not talking air defense and ballistics and flamingos and anywhere else, but what does that mean for the body you represent, their ability to produce weapons across the whole requirement, all the capability requirements internally, and not have to rely on permissions from elsewhere that might not be coming?
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. First of all, I want to say thank you to HR, because we in Ukraine know very precise that the only way of dealing with Russian is to begin one's conversation with shoveling the shovel in his face. It's just the first step, like boom, and then you can get the conversation. So I think that, our analytics shows that we have more than 60% of Ukrainian-made weapons that are actually deployed, and if we will combine this scale with the, I don't know how it's called in NATO armies, we call it the coefficient of combat efficiency. So what if we're taking some weapon, let us say the howitzer or APC, whatever, how much time does it fight at the front line, and how much time do you need it to be serviced? You were speaking about some NATO-made weapon systems, they have sometimes coefficient of 15%, 20%, that 80% they're not on the front line. Of course, what we can deliver is the rate of 80, 90%, because we having the leaders of Ukrainian defense industry here at this forum, the biggest Ukrainian defense industrial company here, the front row, Vlad Bedebas from Ukrainian Armor, and they have their servicemen, 24/7 with their service kits just deployed on the front line. Immediately, then you have to take your weapon system to Poland or wherever to get it maintenance. It's the first issue. The second thing that I think we see to be misconcepted by some of our allies and some politicians of our allies, I think it's this notion that, so Ukraine can scale up and they need investment. No, we don't need investments. Our facilities right now working for, if I'm saying about the drone producers, even the major one, it's like 20, 30, 40%. Some more classical hardcore stuff like ammunition or APCs, howitzers, we're working 50% of our capacity. So we can actually, and we've done it by ourselves, by our investment that we've made, selling weapons and to Ukrainian government. We have very limited profits in Ukraine. They are regulated, but nevertheless, and I'm speaking only about my association, the Naudi, our association, that is not the only one. We are the largest, but we're not the only one. For 3 years of full-scale invasion, our companies relocated 250,000 tons of equipment from the east, 250,000 tons. We built from the scratch like more than 20 new huge facilities, mainly at the west of Ukraine. It was done by our self-investments from inside Ukraine. So what we are really need is the new model, and I think the Danish are setting the example, some of the Nordic countries, of financing the Ukrainian defense industry on a standpoint of financing our final product. So we can have, I think it's easily, I can say easily up to 80% of Ukrainian-made products at the front line if we will have the right financing, if we will have the financing model that will, encourage us to produce more. We see those initiatives in Europe, of course, and we understand that, one of our talking points, to the governments of our allies is that we understand that you need to fulfill your own military industrial strategy. Your stockpiles depleted, you out of weapons, you have to scale your army, you have to have stuff, and you will buy this stuff from your own military industry. Obviously, you always will support the local producer. But if you can relocate the part of the money that you are spending, like buying your expensive stuff, I'm sorry for these words, for Ukraine, and to transfer it to Ukrainian military industry, we can make it 5 times more. Less expensive, very combat-proven, efficient weapon systems to be deployed at the next day or next week, and with a service rate of 80, 90%, because many of those items are being serviced at the front line.
Can I just clarify something? Yeah. Sorry. When you said that you don't need investment, because you've got surplus capacity, did I understand that
sure.
correctly? Yeah. But you do need financing to keep those factories going?
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
So you need
financing. We need the procurement. We need some money to produce the stuff that we have, the weapon systems that we have, and to supply them to Ukrainian armed forces from Ukrainian state budget, which unfortunately is very limited. We are in a bit of crisis, or with this kind of international approach, international models like Danish are doing, some of the European countries are doing, investing directly, not investing, procuring directly from the Ukrainian defense industries.
I'll come back to you in a moment.
Just a quick point on this too, just to clarify. That a lot of the U.S. assistance that had gone to Ukraine, and now the European purchasing of weapons, that money's being spent in the United States. I just want to address this because it's a big point of Russian disinformation, that U.S. assistance is somehow being stolen or because of corruption in Ukraine and so forth. That money was spent, the vast majority of that money was spent in the United States.
I will come back to you in a moment, Sergey, but I know Michael is going to have some interesting points to answer specifically there. So Michael, co-host of my second favourite podcast, War on the Rocks, would you address Sergey's point there, and particularly the financing investment side, and about the capacity issue?
I'm sorry, just for your understanding, Mr. Prime Minister, like now one of the companies of our association, one of the largest drone producers here, they are investing their own money into production in the United Kingdom. It was in use like yesterday. So we even invest our own money into the European production, but we need to have this procurement to be done.
Is that going to work, Michael? Are we going to be able to produce the heavy metal required here, or is this going to get bogged down into policy and permissions and regulation, as we've seen before? The more that the more that Ukraine integrates, works alongside global supporters and European supporters, are we then going to be absolutely mired in the bureaucracy that slows us down?
So I think relative to production capacity, Ukraine's defense sector remains heavily undercapitalized. And at the end of the day, Ukraine needs more and more foreign exchange. That's why they're deliberating on switching to exports, because Ukraine in some areas can produce more drones and capabilities than it needs and actually can get foreign exchange by exporting them at this point in the war. But in general, it's a heavily undercapitalized sector. And if you look at, as I said, as you look at Ukraine's own Ministry of Defense procurement budget, it's quite tiny relative to what the sector can produce. The second part is, in a number of areas, Ukrainian companies are technology leaders, right? But they need outs. They need to either partner with Western companies in order to gain access to Western markets. Ukraine's defense market is structured very different from that of major Western ones, where primes tend to dominate, and you need to have access to that market no matter how good your technology is, right? And then there are many startups and many, I think, innovative companies, and whether it's producers of technology, whether it's distributed types of assembly and production facilities that also themselves are working on potential exit strategies. That's how do they get access more to Western markets? And what's the future of Ukrainian defense looks like potentially after this war? Because Ukraine can be part of the European rearmament story and a major contributor to European security, right? Because we all know that this war revealed not only deficits in European capacity, which I fully agree with my colleague HR, but also that in terms of munitions, which is how you opened up this conversation, Europe at large, and I think NATO as a whole, including the United States, were woefully short of the requirements of a major war, great power war. We've been talking about it for quite some time, but none of us really made those investments, right? And it's quite evident that it's going to take years for Europe to rearm, and not to the level of munitions of what was available before the war, because the level was woefully short. My own experience, having gone to Ukraine many a times and having traveled to the front line, is that many European armies would have been off the battlefield in the first weeks of this war, either out of men, munitions, or equipment. They are militaries with great capabilities, specialization, but they're simply not set up necessarily for this kind of fight, and this war, I think, is quite revelatory.
Michael, a lot of talk at the moment about the coalition of the willing. Should we not be talking instead of the coalition of the capable? There's a lot of willing people out there, but actually that doesn't amount to a hill of beans if you can't actually back it up. So where is the gulf? Is it a big gulf between the willing and the capability that's out there?
Look, there's a problem on both ends, and I'm going to offer you an American perspective, right? Although I've written on the subject some months back with my colleague Jack Watling at RUSI, and I think our bottom line assessment is that if you look at European militaries today, the capability is there to deploy something along the lines of a multinational division to Ukraine if it's meant to be a reassurance or deterrence force. It is. It will require trade-offs on current agreements regarding NATO regional defense plans, but strategy is about choices, right? It's about choosing to do something, prioritizing something over something else, okay? No matter how this war ends, Ukraine is going to need a security commitment, okay? Otherwise, a deal signed with Russia is never going to be worth any paper it's signed on, okay? If If you believe that a ceasefire is the likely ending for this war, Ukraine will need some kind of security commitment beyond just pledges of arms purchases and whatnot by European countries or transfer of Patriot batteries. It is going to need some kind of boots on the ground, some sort of air mission, most likely from NATO territory, and initial coordination support from the United States. The U.S., since the Alaska summit, has shifted on this issue. As you know, this country that's hosting us now very much wanted a U.S. backstop as part of enabling them to put together this coalition of the willing, and the U.S. has moved a bit on that position towards what Starmer wanted. And now I think from a U.S. perspective, the question is, are Europeans actually going to come up with it? This is a little bit of a story, I'll be blunt, of fake it till you make it. Europe was forced in this position by virtue of Washington, D.C. pushing ahead with negotiations and European colleagues wanting a seat at the table. I understand that. But now European colleagues have to make it real. It is a matter of almost inevitability from my point of view, not to be overly deterministic about this, but events have been set into motion such that this is going to end with some kind of European deployment or commitment to Ukraine. It's just a question of what it's going to look like. So far, I'm personally a bit disappointed by the lack of will because I think the capability is there and could be there if people are willing. And the analysts like me, I mean, the most basic task for us is to count it. Tanks, aircraft, brigades, divisions, we can't.
But to your point, I completely agree with you, Michael, but this thing, this entity, whatever it is, peacekeeping force, these boots on the ground, whatever they do, they are not going to engage Russians in warfighting. That is just not going to happen. That being so, there is nothing to stop them going now. That's what we should do. We should deploy them now.
Let me go back on this. The value of this force is first and foremost is to keep a Ukrainian military after this war in place, to give Ukrainians hope, okay, and to make sure that the Ukrainian army after this war is not demobilized, does not leave the country, right, for lack of hope that the war can easily be renewed, right? Second, this force is a reassurance force and it's a deterrence force, but it's not going to take over the primary task of deterrence and defense from the Ukrainian military. And third, it will be a useful backstop. There is a degree of deterrence offered by the ambiguity, and I know folks always worry about, well, what if they're attacked by Russians, let's say? And my immediate answer kind of as a military analyst, if people are so afraid that any casualties would be lost in this kind of deployment, then we have a larger credibility problem as NATO. And if folks can't deploy something along the lines of a multinational division, then we have an even bigger problem given the commitments that have been made as part of NATO regional defense plans, right? To some extent, I sort of asked them, what are we doing here from a NATO perspective? And lastly, I don't think Russia is going to necessarily be that eager to tackle this force either. There are potential consequences, uncertainties for them as well. Bottom line, yeah, I think that folks who are saying, but we have to wait for a ceasefire, need to also ask themselves something basic. Yeah. It's not that often when a ceasefire is made that the ceasefire doesn't in some way also break down. It's very rare to get a perfect ceasefire the day it's made. Yeah. So Europeans planning to deploy a force when there's a ceasefire, and the moment the ceasefire breaks down, which the track record of dealings with Russia suggests to us that it's going to almost...
It'll never,
yeah. Are they going to then withdraw this force and deploy it each time and withdraw it?
Get going.
Sergey, you wanted to add something. And while Sergey is answering, could I get a mic, please, down here for Vladislav? We'll go to questions afterwards. And I had a question down the front here.
Yes, thank you. Just supporting what Michael said, I think that there is no way of having some viable, security guarantees without including the Ukrainian defense industrial industry in these security guarantees. Because obviously, we can provide for, let us say we have a ceasefire, we can provide for ourselves, we can make huge stockpiles. You have the companies here that can produce, it's only one company that can produce more 155s than all of the United States of America. Now, just one company, So having this industrial part into the security guarantees that will assure that, we will be concentrated on our industry, we'll have the finance to support our army, to supply, of making stocks. I think it's one of the important issues that we have to address because we all understand that the finance, and the funds of our allied nations will be providing for their security if we will have some ceasefires.
Okay, we'll go to questions. I've only got 10 minutes left. One of the panelists has been speaking for a bit more time than I'd budgeted for. I'm not going to say who, Alexander. But Vladislav, you have a question?
Yeah, I would like to address to you the question, how can we move the policy of United States and United Kingdom from cooperation with Ukraine economically wise, because we are now discussing here how do we invest or not invest, or we need financing, etc. But to my opinion, we have to approach it, our allies have to approach it as a military threat. A military threat means that we need the deliveries whatever cost and with any means, because most of the partners we are cooperating with from United States, from UK, they consider it as a business. So they invest in expansion of the business production, of the equipment production, like when they will return on investment, etc. But to be frank, it's like, that's why we have all these delays in our deliveries, in productions, in scaling, and you started your panel from the Russian is manufacturing much greater figures. And when you revert back to World War II, UK and US was producing some enormous quantity of equipment to fight this war. So you already have this experience. And unfortunately, we are having this the same in the future. Now in World War III, we're having same. Russia is multiplying that production, whatever cost and whatever means.
Boris, as the only politician here, talk to us about political capital. How do you use the power of high office to make that change, to galvanise support, to really get the coalition going?
I think that in this country, in the UK, there is massive support for Ukraine. It wasn't difficult for me. I think in other parts of Europe, it's plainly been ebbing a bit. In the US, they have a slightly freaky wing of the Republican Party where they have some sort of weird, sort of homoerotic veneration for Putin, which I don't understand. And we got to manage that. But I think people see it very much as a black and white thing. And I think in Britain, I go around the villages of Oxfordshire, I still see Ukrainian flags, people wearing, Ukrainian ties. People know that this is a war between good and evil.
Michael?
Can I share one thing on that? So just a pure analyst perspective, the solution is well known to most political leaders and decision makers that I know I've dealt with, and it's called multi-year contracts to industry, okay? No industry is going to set up a new production line and substantially expand production for a war that might end next year, or for armament demands or capability demands that might change next year. It's very straightforward. You have to issue the contracts, and then you have to fund it, okay? And everybody knows how to do it. And often I end up in conversation with ask if only there was some way to fix this. And there is a very well-known way, and everybody knows what it is. It's just a question of obligating the money and issuing multi-year contracts to industry.
Yeah. There were two questions at the back.
Thank you. Boris Johnson reminding us that from Putin's perspective, the root of the problem is Ukraine's existence. It seems to me that from Ukraine's perspective, the root of the problem is Putin. Will it be any different if Putin is not there?
Thank you. And if the gentleman to your left, please, we'll take two at a time because time's short.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a thoroughly fascinating discussion. As we've heard from several of the Ukrainian speakers tonight, unity is absolutely key if we're going to face up with the threat. We're saying this at a time where over the last 20 years we've seen the biggest division in NATO, not just between countries as we've got today, but within countries as well. If we are to bridge this gap and to actually deal with the threat head on, what can we do to start depolarizing our politics and thereby society?
Thank you. So, better the devil you know, and how do we draw society together?
Well, I'm sure there are a lot more Russian experts in this room than I am, but I do think, that these authoritarian regimes don't have to be that strong. They just have to be stronger than any organized opposition. And what Putin has been very good at is demobilizing any kind of opposition through the most brutal tactics of not just imprisonment, but assassination and so forth. And so he's fragmented the opposition, and so there needs to be some sort of an alternative that emerges within Russia. He has brought with him, of course, this hyper-national class of people and surrounded himself with them in the Kremlin and in the Duma. I don't think Patrushev would be any better than Vladimir Putin, but I do think if Putin is clear, it's clear to the Russian people that he's failing, that there will be a demand for some sort of an alternative. Now, does that mean a Russia will emerge that will see its future clearly with the West? I mean, probably not. But I do think when people say, well, he's the devil you know, it's better than the devil you don't know, I don't buy that either, because it's hard to imagine anything worse than Putin. So we don't know. My colleague Stephen Kotkin at the Hoover Institution has written a great essay about the 5 different alternative futures potentially in Russia. I highly recommend it. It's a foreign affairs essay from some time ago.
You want to say a quick word, Michael?
Yeah, just the one thing on that. I think, on the one hand, it's clear that it's not just a Putin problem, it's fundamentally a Russia problem, right? And any future Russian leader is going to come from that group of elites and that strategic culture. On the other hand, in the personalist authoritarian regime, the leader and what they think does matter. And Putin clearly not only has specific views, sentiments, and fixations on Ukraine, but is committed to this war. And so I'm very much with HR of the folks who somehow worry about what will happen if there's a regime change, transition of power. I personally think that that should be a much lesser concern. I don't think it could be much worse in terms of settling the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. There was a neat little cluster of 3 down here.
I mean, just I quickly say on the divisions of NATO point, just make one small point, which is that actually, yes, our societies are divided a bit about the war in Ukraine, though, as I say, in the UK, it's very, very united. But NATO, interestingly, is going through a bit of a good patch at the moment.
Turning the tide.
At least in this sense that the alliance is spending much more on its own defence and has just welcomed 2 new members.
HR, did you want to address that point?
No, I just think what leaders have to do is to clearly communicate what is at stake in Ukraine. And of course, within Ukraine itself, Ukraine is intrinsically important. But as I mentioned earlier, to place the Ukraine war in context of the broader competition against this axis of aggressors. So those who make the argument that we should abandon security in Europe or not pay as much attention to all play little kids football and run to the Taiwan Strait don't recognize the global dimension of the conflict and the degree to which China is underwriting this war effort. And I think could be argued China is fighting a proxy war against Europe through the Russians.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes, Boris Johnson, if you were Prime Minister now, what more would you do to support Ukraine?
So my name is Pete Toms. I'm chairman of the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. Reference was made to the U.S. pulling out troops to move them to Asia. What does Europe do to replace the American deterrent with tactical nuclear weapons, not strategic, but tactical, for those countries like the Baltics and Poland?
Hello. First of all, I would like to say thanks, all of you, for support Ukraine people. The panel Strategic Architecture of Victory. Do you have some strategic to solve one main problem of components from China? For example, me is a producer, manufacturer of electronic warfare systems, and 80% of components of our systems is from China. We try to find some components in Ukraine or in Europe, in United States, in other countries, but no chances. Do you have some strategic to solve this problem?
Thank you. So imagine the world where Boris Johnson has come back as Prime Minister. You've been asked, what more would you do to support Ukraine?
I think I've got more chance of getting elected in Ukraine by the time of it.
What would you?
I think.
What would you do?
Look, honestly, so I tried to say it earlier on. Look, I think so much of this is about, Ukraine's got a manpower problem, Russia's got a money problem. But Ukraine also, as we've heard, Ukraine needs investment in its warfighting capabilities. That 250 billion, it's a disgrace we haven't got that out of Belgium. That, I think, would make a big, big difference to morale. I think it'd also make a big psychological difference to Putin, because Putin would think, my God, that's a huge wall of money that's suddenly in the hands of my opponents in Ukraine. Maybe I should think about the way I'm handling it. So I would go on that, and then all the other things. I think on the coalition of the willing, I would be trying to campaign with our friends to say, look, these guys are never going to be fighting a war, ergo, why are we hanging around? They're there for political purposes. They're there to show that Ukraine is, the ultimate destiny of Ukraine is as part of the Western security architecture. Get them in now, that's what I would do.
Sergey, it's appropriate. As a representative from your brave country, you have the last word. How do we get ourselves off Chinese components of our supply system?
We're trying to find out this question by ourselves, and we have no answer, unfortunately, because the procedures in the free world, they are not modified to the war that we have. But if I may, for 30 seconds, just to give a perspective from Ukraine, we believe, and it's a core belief based on our history and our history of oppression from Russia, that the real problem, Putin is an element of the problem. The real problem is the Russian nation that encompasses this imperialism for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the revival and this resentment of Russians that we have to have empire. We need empire. We had Russian Empire, then we had the Bolshevik Empire, then we have now the new Russian Empire. They are just getting those people like Putin in charge of Russia. So if Putin will, become dead, he will die this night, which we all hope, of course, for.
Not
then we will have
his organs.
we will have maybe 10 years of break, pause to do our job properly and to prepare for the next Putin in some 10, 15 years. I think that we had many not sufficient discussion about the Chinese role and their plan for Europe through Russia, to using Russia as their proxy.
Well, that feels like the start of a whole new panel, at which point we better draw stumps. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.